Long before Thor became the most beloved god of the Norse pantheon, long before his hammer shook mountains and split the sky, there was only a simple truth written into the fabric of the nine realms: the cosmos needed a protector. Chaos, giants, storms, hunger, and the unpredictable cold of the northern world threatened the fragile order the gods were trying to build. And from this need, Thor stepped into existence not merely as a warrior, but as a living shield. Thor was born from Elder Utgard, a personification of the natural world itself, and Odin, the wandering seeker of wisdom. This made Thor fundamentally different from many of the other gods. He was not a ruler. He was not a weaver of fate. He was not a master of magic or trickery. He was the embodiment of something far more grounded: strength as a force of stability. To the Vikings, this was more than mythology. It reflected how deeply they admired physical resilience. Their world demanded it: storms, long winters, dangerous seas, and constant threats from rival tribes carved a culture in which sheer survival became sacred. Thor became the symbol of this struggle. He was not a distant god sitting above humanity. He was the hammer in their hand, the thunder above their farms, the force that kept chaos at bay. Myths describe Thor as red-bearded, broad-shouldered, with a booming voice and a temper as quick as lightning. But these exaggerated images hide a subtler truth: that Vikings saw Thor not as an ideal warrior, but as the necessary one. He wasn't clever like Loki or wise like Odin. He didn't negotiate. He didn't manipulate. Instead, he met threats head-on because the world he guarded left no room for hesitation. In this way, Thor reflects the real-life values of early Scandinavians. Archaeologists have found countless Thor's hammer pendants, called Mjolnir amulets, worn by both men and women. These weren't symbols of violence. They were symbols of protection, fertility, and everyday survival. Many were hung over beds, buried in graves, or placed in homes as a charm against storms or evil spirits. In a sense, Thor was present in every Viking household, not as a mythic being, but as a guardian spirit watching over the fragile flame of life. But Thor's role as protector wasn't purely symbolic. In the mythology, the most dominant threat to order came from the Jotnar of the giants. They weren't merely large beings. They represented the forces of chaos, unpredictability, and wild nature. The giants weren't always evil, but they were always dangerous. In the Viking worldview, order and chaos were not enemies but inseparable opposites, constantly clashing. And Thor stood at the front line of that eternal conflict. Unlike Odin, who sought treaties or secret knowledge to maintain balance, Thor's duty was simple: to keep chaos in check by force when necessary. His battles with giants weren't acts of cruelty but acts of preservation. Without Thor, the nine realms would collapse under the weight of wild, consuming entropy. As he grew, Thor wasn't trained in diplomacy or strategy. His education was in storms, wind, earth, and raw strength. Every clap of thunder became associated with him, not because he caused storms, but because storms reflected him. His essence was the power that rolls across the sky, announcing itself with sound and force before it arrives. In many ways, Thor was the most human of the gods. He ate enormous amounts of food, drank heavily, laughed loudly, made mistakes, acted impulsively, and often saw the world in simple terms: danger, protection, justice. And this humanity is exactly what made him divine in the eyes of the Norse. A god who understood human struggle was far more meaningful than one who existed beyond it. Yet despite his brute strength, Thor was not mindless. The earliest poems describe him as a judge of fairness, a defender of farmers and laborers, and a force that hated deceit. He was predictable. And in a dangerous world, predictability was a blessing. The nine realms knew one thing for certain: as long as Thor's heartbeat echoed through the sky, as long as Mjolnir returned to his hand, as long as thunder rolled above the world, chaos would never fully win. Thor was not born to rule. He was born to protect. And his legend begins not with battle, but with a promise. If Thor was born to protect the nine realms, then Mjolnir was the tool that made that destiny possible. But the story of the hammer's creation is not a peaceful one. It is chaotic, accidental, and fused with magic, rivalry, and danger, of a perfect reflection of the world Thor was meant to defend. The myth begins not in Asgard, but with Loki, the trickster whose cleverness was equal only to his ability to cause trouble. One day, Loki decided to mock Thor's wife, the gentle and golden-haired Sif, by cutting off her hair while she slept. It was a small act of cruelty, meant as a joke, but Thor did not find it amusing. His rage was legendary, and Loki knew that if he didn't fix the problem quickly, Thor might break every bone in his body before breakfast. To undo the damage, Loki descended into the world of the dwarves as Svartalfheim, the land of master craftsmen. Among the dwarves were two legendary brothers, Sindri Eitri and Brock, artisans whose creations rivaled the power of the gods themselves. Loki begged them to craft something so magnificent that Sif would forgive him. The brothers, ever competitive, agreed. But Loki couldn't help making things worse. He challenged them, saying they could never craft items more powerful than the ones made by Ivaldi's sons, another group of dwarven smiths. The brothers accepted the challenge, and Loki, panicking that he might lose his bet, transformed into a fly and tried to sabotage their work. The forging began. Out of the furnace came wonders, Gullinbursti, the golden-bristled boar that glowed brighter than any torch, Draupnir, Odin's ring that dripped new rings every 9 nights. And finally, the weapon destined to become a legend. It was forged in the heart of roaring flames, shaped by hands that understood the language of metal. But Loki's sabotage caused one flaw. The hammer's handle was shorter than intended. Instead of being a long two-handed weapon, it became a compact, heavy, brutally powerful tool of destruction. And that mistake changed everything, because the hammer's shortened handle made it unexpectedly fast, easy to swing, and devastating in close combat. A perfect weapon for Thor, whose power came from direct, overwhelming force. When the gods gathered to judge the treasures, Thor immediately sensed something in Mjolnir. The hammer hummed with elemental energy. Sparks danced across its surface as if lightning were trapped inside it. It felt alive, as though the storms themselves had chosen Thor as their bearer. The dwarves explained its powers. It would never break. It would crush mountains. It would return to Thor's hand no matter where he threw it. And it could channel the force of thunder and lightning. This wasn't just a weapon. It was a declaration. Chaos could be harnessed. Destruction could become protection. To the Vikings, Mjolnir became more than a mythic tool. Archaeologists have discovered hundreds of hammer-shaped pendants across Scandinavia worn around necks, hung in homes, carved into stones. They symbolize fertility, blessing, and protection, in a time when storms and winters could kill entire villages. The idea of a god defending humanity with lightning was comforting. Interestingly, the flaw Loki caused, the short handle, mirrors the reality of Viking tools. Many hammers found in excavations have short handles, designed for heavy, rapid strikes. This is why Thor's hammer looks unlike typical war hammers. It represents the Viking belief that practical, brutal tools could also be sacred. Mjolnir was more than metal. It was a bridge between worlds, the divine and the human, strength and responsibility, chaos and order. Yet even with the hammer, Thor's path was not simple. The giants were growing stronger. Storms were stirring in distant realms, and Loki's mischief, as usual, was far from over. Mjolnir had been born. Now it needed to prove itself. Thor would soon face trials that would test not only his strength, but the very limits of what a protector could be. Mjolnir now rested in Thor's hand, humming with the weight of storms. But a weapon alone does not make a legend. Before Thor became the unshakable defender of gods and humans, he had to face the trials that would carve his identity into the very bones of the 9 realms. His first true battles were not glorious sagas sung by skalds. They were messy, dangerous, and often humbling. The giants of Jotunheim, the eternal enemies of order, saw in Thor a threat to their ancient way of life. To them, he was not a god, but an untested challenger swinging a new toy. The first trial came when Thor heard that a group of giants had descended from the icy mountains and were terrorizing the people of Midgard. These humans, fragile and mortal, had no defense against beings who could level their homes with a single strike. Thor descended upon them without hesitation, carrying Mjolnir in one hand and a determination that seemed older than he was. But he was young, and he underestimated the giants. The ground shook as they approached, the towering figures of frost and stone, each as large as a house. Thor charged, roaring with a storm in his chest, but the giants surrounded him before he could raise his hammer. One struck him with a blow so powerful it sent him crashing into the earth. For the first time, Thor experienced fear. Not fear of death, he feared failing the people he came to protect. This moment changed him. It burned humility into his spirit like lightning carving a tree. Thor rose again, slower, wiser, and with a new understanding. Strength without discipline is chaos, the very thing he was meant to fight. He tightened his grip on Mjolnir and focused. Instead of attacking wildly, he watched the giant's movements, timing his strikes with precision. The hammer flew through the air, returning to him again and again, crushing limbs, shattering ice, breaking stone. The giants fell one by one, like mountains collapsing in slow motion. When the battle ended, the sky was quiet except for the soft roll of distant thunder. The mortals he saved whispered prayers to him, not out of fear, but gratitude. It was the first time Thor tasted the weight of admiration and the responsibility that came with it. But battles were only one part of Thor's trials. Another came from within his own family. Thor's half-brother Tyr, god of law and war, tested Thor in ways no giant could. Tyr was calm, strategic, and respected across the realms. He wanted to know whether Thor was merely strong or capable of leadership. Their duels were not violent but symbolic. Tyr taught Thor patience, restraint, and the importance of justice. In these moments, Thor learned that a protector must not only defeat enemies but also uphold order. Yet Loki, ever the trickster, shaped Thor's growth just as much. He mocked Thor's simplicity, encouraged impulsiveness, and provoked him into dangerous situations, sometimes out of malice, sometimes to force Thor to adapt. In this way, Loki became an accidental mentor, teaching Thor how to outthink those who would manipulate him. The greatest early trial, however, was the journey to the Hall of Geirr, a giant known not for brute strength but cunning cruelty. Geirr despised Thor and plotted to kill him using traps rather than sheer force. This enemy challenged everything Thor believed in: honor, fairness, and straightforward battle. And like other giants, Geirr refused open combat. He used ambushes, illusions, and poison weapons. Thor had to abandon his usual instincts and rely on quick thinking and caution. When he finally confronted the giant, the battle was fought not with sweeping blows but with careful steps and calculated strikes. Thor emerged victorious, but not unharmed. He limped back to Asgard, wounded, exhausted, and changed. After this trial, even Odin looked at his son differently, not as a reckless storm, but as a force shaped by struggle, tempered by failure, and guided by purpose. After this trial, even Odin looked at his son differently, not as a reckless storm, but as a force shaped by struggle, tempered by failure, and guided by purpose. The nine realms began to whisper Thor's name with a new tone, not as a loud young warrior, but as the hammer that would hold back darkness. And yet, the greatest trial still awaited him, a challenge so vast that it would define not just Thor, but the fate of all realms. The journey to Jotunheim and the encounter with a giant king whose strength rivaled the gods themselves. Thor's fame had begun to spread through the nine realms, but with fame came challenge, and with challenge came the unknown. It was during one of his journeys with Loki and 2 human servants that Thor found himself walking toward one of the strangest and most deceptive tests of his entire life, the castle of Utgard-Loki, the king of illusions. Jotunheim was a place of frost, mist, and ancient dangers, but nothing in those lands prepared Thor for what awaited him inside Utgard-Loki's hall. It was a fortress so enormous that even Thor, used to giants, felt small beneath its shadow. When he knocked on the gate, his blows sounded like pebbles falling against stone, not because Thor was weak, but because the king wished it so. From the moment they entered, nothing was as it seemed. Utgard-Loki, disguised as a massive giant, greeted them with a smile to come for someone welcoming the Stormbringer, but he was not afraid. Instead, he challenged Thor and his companions to partake in a series of tests, claiming that no one could enter his hall without proving their worth. Thor, proud and confident, accepted immediately. The first challenge was offered to Loki, an eating contest against a giant named Loki. Loki devoured an entire trough of meat with astonishing speed, but Loki devoured the meat, the bones, and even the wooden trough itself. Loki was defeated not by hunger, but by wildfire, for Loki was not a giant at all, but the living embodiment of fire's hunger. Then came contests for Thor's human companions, drinking, running, and lifting, and each time they failed. But they failed not because they were weak, but because they competed against illusions, thought itself, the speed of wildfire, and forces beyond mortal comprehension. Finally, Thor stepped forward, his pride aching from watching his group lose. "I will be tested," he declared. "Let me face your greatest challenge." Utgard-Loki smiled. He first handed Thor a drinking horn and told him to empty it. Thor drank deeply. Thunder rolled in his chest as he swallowed mouthful after mouthful, but the horn never emptied. What Thor didn't know was that the other end of the horn was connected to the sea. And with every gulp, he was lowering the ocean itself. Later, the Vikings would claim that Thor's drinking created the tides. Frustrated but undeterred, Thor demanded another test. Utgard-Loki pointed to an enormous grey cat. "Lift this creature off the ground." Thor, offended by such a simple task, bent down and raised the cat with all his might. Muscles rippled, the ground cracked, and Thor roared in effort, but he managed to lift only one of the cat's paws. Only later did Thor learn the truth. The cat was not a cat. It was Jormungandr, the World Serpent, disguised by illusion. Even lifting a single paw was a feat so tremendous that the entire castle whispered in shock. But Thor was furious. He demanded one final challenge, a wrestling match. Utgard-Loki agreed and brought forward an old woman. Thor hesitated. Wrestling an elderly woman felt dishonorable. But he had no choice if he wanted to prove himself. He grappled with her and found himself pushed down to one knee. She overpowered him slowly, like winter overtaking a dying fire. Thor later learned the woman's name, Heli, the embodiment of old age. No god, no giant, no human could defeat aging. Thor had not lost, he had endured the inevitable. When the tests ended, Utgard-Loki praised Thor for accomplishing the impossible without realizing it. He told Thor the truth behind every illusion, revealing the depth of Thor's hidden power. But then, in an instant, he vanished, along with the entire castle. The land returned to its barren, icy stillness. Thor, enraged at being deceived, swung Mjolnir wildly, but hit nothing. Utgard-Loki had escaped, leaving behind only the echo of his laughter. This trial transformed Thor more than any battle. He learned that strength alone could not conquer the world. Cunning, illusion, and unseen forces were just as powerful. For the first time, Thor understood humility not as weakness but as wisdom. And the giants, far from simple brutes, proved that chaos had many faces. Thor left Jotunheim that day with a quieter heart, a sharper mind, and a renewed sense of purpose. The protector of the realms had been tested not in strength, but in perception. His greatest battles were still ahead. Thor's battles with giants were legendary, but none tested the limits of existence as profoundly as the day he sailed into the deep, cold waters of the world to confront a creature whose body circled the entire earth. This was not a war, not a feast, not a trial of illusions. This was the moment when Thor came face to face with fate itself, the World Serpent, Jormungandr. The story begins with Thor traveling to the Hall of Hymir, a frost giant known for his bad temper, his enormous cauldron, and his unmatched strength. Hymir despised the gods and made no effort to hide it when Thor arrived, disguised as a traveler. But Thor needed Hymir's great cauldron for a feast in Asgard, and so he swallowed his pride and played along. Hymir agreed to lend the cauldron on one condition: Thor had to accompany him on a fishing trip into the deepest part of the sea. Even for a god, this was dangerous. The oceans of Norse mythology weren't just masses of water, they were living, shifting realms filled with ancient spirits, unpredictable storms, and creatures older than memory. And beneath all of it lay Jormungandr, the serpent born from Loki, destined to kill Thor at Ragnarök. The boat creaked under their combined weight as they pushed into the misty waters. Hymir rowed silently, his face cold as ice. Thor, sensing tension, offered to find bait, and with one clean strike, he tore the head off Hymir's prized ox. Hymir's eyes widened, but Thor simply smiled. They sailed until the sea darkened to a shade that seemed almost alive. Waves rose like breathing giants. The air was thick, heavy, as if holding its breath. Thor placed the ox's head on an iron hook and cast it into the abyss. For a moment, nothing happened. Just stillness. Just silence. Just the creaking of wood against the endless water. Then a pull so immense that the entire boat lurched downward, nearly capsizing. The line shook as if a mountain were waking beneath the waves. Thor braced himself, his muscles swelling like storm clouds. He pulled. The sea roared. Waves exploded. Thunder cracked overhead. Something vast began to rise. Jormungandr's enormous body broke the surface, coiling upward like a living continent. Its eyes were ancient, glowing with a cold intelligence. Its fangs dripped poison strong enough to melt stone. As Thor and the serpent locked gazes, the world seemed to narrow to a single point, two forces destined to meet again in the final battle. Thor tightened his grip on Mjolnir. This was no ordinary enemy. This was the boundary of the world made flesh. He raised the hammer to strike to end the serpent before its time, but Hymir, terrified, cut the fishing line. In an instant, the serpent sank back into the deep, vanishing beneath a whirlpool of churning waves. Thor roared in fury, the echo traveling through sky and sea alike. Lightning flashed. Thunder bellowed. But fate had spoken. Ragnarök could not be prevented. The serpent had to survive for their final confrontation. The Vikings believed this myth explained the power of storms at sea. When thunder rolled over the ocean, they imagined Thor battling Jormungandr beneath the waves, their clash causing the sky to flash and the waters to shake. Fishermen prayed to Thor for protection because he alone had faced the monster that encircled the world. As Thor and Hymir returned to shore, the giant trembled with fear, not from the storm, but from Thor's restrained fury. He knew Thor had nearly ended the world that day, whether through victory or catastrophe. But Thor said nothing. He simply lifted Hymir's impossibly heavy cauldron, a feat no other being could perform, and began the long journey back to Asgard. He carried not just a cauldron, but the knowledge of the serpent he would one day kill, and the certainty that when that day came, the world would burn with it. Thor's battles, trials, and journeys shaped the 9 realms in the myths, but his greatest impact was not in the halls of Asgard or the seaplains of Jotunheim. It was in the minds and hearts of the people who told his stories, the Vikings themselves. For them, Thor wasn't just a god of thunder. He was a guardian of ordinary life, a symbol of endurance, and a reminder that strength was not merely physical, but spiritual. Across Scandinavia, archaeologists have discovered hundreds of small Mjolnir pendants. They were carved from iron, silver, amber, bone, and even simple stone. Some were detailed, others crude and rough, but all carried the same meaning: Thor protects. These pendants were worn by warriors heading into battle, by farmers praying for rain, by mothers hoping to keep their families safe through long winters. Even children had their own small hammers placed around their necks. Mjolnir was not a symbol of violence, it was a symbol of continuity, a reassurance that no matter how harsh the world became, storms, famine, disease, raids, someone was watching over them. Someone who understood hardship because he lived with it as well. The Viking world was unpredictable and unforgiving. Crops could fail, the sea could swallow a ship without warning, a rival clan could burn a village in a single night. In such a world, the idea of a god who fought tirelessly, who made mistakes yet rose again, who defended rather than ruled, this was deeply comforting. Thor wasn't loved because he was perfect. He was loved because he was dependable. This connection between humans and their god was reflected in rituals. Before important decisions, Viking leaders would bless weapons or food by holding them under a symbolic hammer sign. Thor's name was invoked in weddings to ensure fertility and harmony, and in funerals to guide the dead safely through the storm-ridden paths to the afterlife. Even after Christianity spread through the north, Thor remained in the hearts of the people. Some carved Mjolnir symbols on their gravestones alongside Christian crosses, blending two worlds into one. This was not defiance. It was continuity, a quiet statement that their ancestors' protector still mattered. And yet, Thor's myth was not without darkness. According to prophecy, Thor was destined to face Jormungandr again during Ragnarök, the final battle that would end the world. The serpent would rise from the ocean, poison dripping from its jaws, its coils crushing the land. Thor would kill the beast, but only after taking 9 steps before collapsing from its venom. This was not a tragic ending in Viking eyes. It was honorable. It meant Thor fulfilled his duty until his last breath. It meant order held against chaos, even for a moment. But the myths also say that after the destruction of the world, a new earth will rise from the sea, green, peaceful, reborn, and among the survivors will be two of Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, carrying Mjolnir into the next age, Thor's strength, his protection, his spirit, all would continue. This idea resonated deeply with the Viking worldview. Even when everything collapses, life continues, hope survives, strength returns. In this way, Thor became not just a mythic figure, but a cultural cornerstone. He represented the storm that passes, the sun that rises afterward, and the courage needed to endure the long night. His thunder was not fearsome, it was familiar. Like the voice of a guardian reminding people they were not alone. Even today, his influence survives in languages, in stories, in symbols, in modern adaptations, but most importantly, in the ancient belief that somewhere beyond the clouds, a protector still raises a hammer against the storm. Thor's legend endures not because he was the strongest, but because he understood the weight of responsibility. He was the defender of gods and humans alike, the hammer that guarded the fragile line between order and chaos. And as long as thunder rolls across the sky, his story will never truly end. And so, Thor's thunder faded into the distance, echoing across the 9 realms like the slow heartbeat of a world that had endured countless storms. His strength shaped lands, protected people, and held chaos at bay. But strength alone never defined fate. For while Thor guarded the realms with force, another god shaped them with something far more unpredictable. A whisper instead of a roar, a question instead of a command, a trick instead of a strike. He was the shadow behind victories, the spark behind disasters, the voice that could twist truth and illusion with equal ease. Loved and hated, trusted and feared, his presence influenced every corner of the Norse cosmos. And now, as the thunder quiets, the world turns toward the god who never walked a straight path, the god whose choices shaped destiny more deeply than any hammer ever could. The story of the 9 realms cannot continue without him. This is the tale of Loki, the trickster who rewrote fate.